day, so that we are not shocked and awed in a negative sense when Messiah returns and all of these things are reinstituted. Isaiah 66, what will be the times of worshiping God? It says it's the Sabbath and the times of the new moon. Okay? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and even I am guilty of this. I don't always acknowledge Rosh Chodesh, which is the new moon. Okay? Rosh Chodesh was a time for worshiping God. The Shabbat was a time of worshiping God. So much of how we function as a body today is going to be flipped on its head and will become nearly unrecognizable in the time of the onset of Messiah's kingdom. I don't want to ruffle feathers, but this is Bible. This is Scripture that we really have a hard time reconciling and allowing to settle within our innermost being, because it's not taught as though it is fact, as though it is Scripture, as though it is going to happen. Why? Because the Scriptures have been Hellenized for many, many centuries. We talked about this in detail on Thursday. The early church fathers saw themselves as a spiritual replacement for physical Israel. Okay? Dispensationalism, replacement theology, all of the whole ontology, which is really the foundation of theology. What is theology? Theos and logos? Really? The science of a God? The study of God? Okay? The Hebrews didn't study God. They believed because they saw, they tasted, they smelt, they could feel. It was sense-based. It was dynamic. It was action-oriented. Okay? The Greeks, it was cerebral. It was intellectual. Let's ponder on this. The wisdom comes from within you. You are wisdom. God is within you. This is how the Greeks functioned, especially Aristotle. He was not quite as abstract as Plato. But the Scriptures were spiritualized and allegorized. Perversely so. When you go back to the Hebraic, you see that the Scriptures are to be taken literally. Literally. And that blows away what has been taught today. It completely takes away the pillars of what has been established as foundation. The moment you go back to the literal, to the new moons, to the Sabbaths, to a, heaven forbid, a literal temple, to a literal holy mountain, and us literally ascending and being allowed to ascend, it changes you as a person. It's a rebirth. It really is a rebirth. Frank?
Isn't this covered in the fact that we're grafted in?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The grafting in process, we're going to be talking in great detail, along with Acts 15, Romans 9 through 11 in the next part of this class. But we will be talking about it, absolutely. Man, I kind of went astray there, guys. But I won't apologize, because this is Scripture.
Needed to be said.
The word Nephar slowly became synonymous with ger, in that it described a person who is not just temporarily residing in the midst of God's people, but actively participating through covenant.
Were the other, the Saphir and the Tushab, were they also able to become a ger?
Yes, and we'll see that in just a little bit, Jenny, as we look into the book of Acts. They do have the opportunity, and we see that the rabbis slowly shifted some of the classifications a little bit. So, now as we enter into Habrit HaChadashah, which is the new covenant, or really more literally the renewed covenant, we see that things have changed. Well, what happened between this time of the 700s BCE and the life of Isaiah and the age of the time of Messiah and his disciples? There was a catastrophic event, correct? The temple was destroyed. We had the Babylonian, the 70-year dispersion. Now that dispersion changed the Jewish psyche, changed the Jewish mentality. A lot happened in those 70 years. And they didn't return the same people. Okay? Fear of assimilation. Fear of assimilation. helps to establish a system of worship that will become what we call halakha, a way of walking, for the first century. Okay? Fences are established, and this is where you begin to see, as a Jewish people within, they established this, a new type of thinking. Okay? They said, never again do we want to go into the dispersion. Let's learn our lessons. We worshipped idols. We didn't allow the land to rest. We didn't allow the land to rest, to be allowed to lay fallow. And the 70 years was a direct result of the disobedience of that specific commandment. Okay? And they said, we're going to build fences around each and every commandment, lest we break the commandment. Before you get to the commandment in the middle, you have to knock a whole bunch of fences over. And this was a protective mechanism, really a fear-based mechanism for the people, because they did not want to be dispersed and enter into an assimilated state again. Because they knew that if this happened again, we could be done for, really. Paranoia was the order of the day, and you can really begin to see a hint of that in the book of Nehemiah and the book of Ezra. At this time, the attitude towards non-Jews was almost exclusively negative. There was a vicious cycle that was created due to occupations, invasions, wars, persecutions. The more the Jewish people emphasized their election, it was this vicious cycle, the deeper the hatred of the surrounding nations to the Jewish people. Okay? The more hatred, the more insular the Jewish community. So it was kind of like this pull. During the days of Yeshua, the land of Israel was separated into what is called the 10 degrees of sanctity. Okay? Which saw the entire land as holy. What being the holiest? Jerusalem, right? To make Aliyah to the highest point, to rise to the highest point in Jerusalem. And the farther away you got from Jerusalem, the less holy the land was considered, though it was still holy. Everything outside of the land of Israel was considered as a graveyard, darkness and death. Yeah.
Is that true today?
I don't know if that's how I know the rabbis get very dogmatic about that. Many of them will still talk about the uncleanness of the nations, but it's within Chabad especially, you see that there is a desire to communicate with the peoples of the nations for the hopes that they would somehow convert to Orthodox Judaism. I can't say exactly if all of Orthodox Judaism believes this, but I know that certain sects definitely do. When one came back from a journey, we've talked about this before, what took place when a Jew came back from the nations? What did he or she do when they entered back into the land over the border? They kicked the dust off their feet. Okay? And this is where in Matthew 10:14, Yeshua builds upon this. He instructs his disciples to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel and announce that the kingdom of heaven is near, proclaiming, but if the people of a house or a town will not welcome you or listen to you, leave it and shake the dust from your feet. Okay? And that place would have been considered as a graveyard, as death. I love how we begin to connect to Messiah's words to the customs, to the traditions, to the idioms of the time. Isn't it amazing? He builds upon that which already existed. Lends kind of a whole new perspective. So they would kick the dust off their feet lest any dust from the nations would contaminate the land itself. And there was no love. Where's the love? This is how Gentiles were viewed at this time. Gentiles pollute everything. Make all unclean. Gentiles were considered children of destruction. These aren't exactly lining up with Isaiah's comforting words, are they? Marrying a Gentile is a capital offense, worthy of death. killing Gentiles counts as righteousness. Oh, isn't that a wonderful statement? You were not allowed to sell or rent land to Gentiles. And, of course, Gentiles have no share in the world to come. Really speaking of the Epicureans, this was a Pharisaic ruling. The Epicureans were really Gentiles, and some would say even Jews, who opposed Pharisaic teaching or Pharisaic authority.
And what is Jubilees in the Mishnah?
These are all extra biblical compendiums, basically, that all of these are part of, in essence, the Talmud. And we're going to be talking about that. The Mishnah and the Gemara are the two elements that make up the Talmud. And we'll get into that a little bit at another class. Just too much, unfortunately, to talk about right now. Now, as far as non-Jews, there was still an element of the mixed multitude within the land comprising of Greeks, of Romans, and others from the surrounding nations. Israel was the major trade route of the time between Asia and the rest of the region. So many Jews ended up residing either temporarily or permanently in the land. This, combined with the creation of the synagogue, saw a whole new type of a classification of non-Jews. So the synagogue, it wasn't started in the land of Israel. It was really started abroad. And it was meant to be a home of worship for Jews who could not make it to the temple and worship in the temple as often as they would like to. Synagoge is the Greek for synagogue, a bringing together. And of course, if you want to say it according to the way Israelis say it, it's the Beit Knesset, the house of meeting. I prefer that term, although it's kind of, the term synagogue is almost ingrained in our vernacular. Well, the concept of the synagogue is believed to have emanated from Ezekiel 11:16. Therefore say, thus says Adonai, though I had removed them far away from the nations, and though I had scattered them from among the countries, yet I was a sanctuary for them a little while in the countries where they had gone. And it was based on this verse that it was decided to create a house in the diaspora for the Jewish people. And of course, for the peoples of the nations who desire to worship therein as well. The road to relationship. Well, here's why is the synagogue so important. Well, the synagogue is so important because it brought the knowledge of Israel's God and of Israel's religion to all Gentile cities where there was a Jewish community. If you remember Rabbi Paul Shaul, in the book of Acts, he would constantly go into these cities, but where did he go in first? He almost always went first to the synagogue, right? And then from the synagogue, he ministered to the observant Jews there, and there were also God-fearers, and we'll talk about that in just a second, who were participating there. But then there was also just the traditional people of the nations who did not believe, who he also ministered to. But he always began in the synagogue. Okay? Wherever there was a remnant of the Jewish people. The road to relationship with the God of Israel went through the Jewish people and the prescribed system of worship. Has this not also been flipped on its head today? What is our common belief, our common understanding today? When a Jew comes to Messiah, we encourage a Jew at times throughout the body to go to church, right? It almost seems to me as though the Jewish people are forced to be grafted into the nations to a certain extent, right? When at its origin, at its head, it was the nations that were to come through Israel. Their expression was to flow through the prescribed Jewish system of worship, from the synagogue and from the temple. Things have been